Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Summer 2020 webinar of the Association for the Advancement of Alternatives Assessment. This is our 7th webinar that we've provided to you. Today, we'll be talking about a very timely and relevant topic, alternatives assessment and environmental justice, current state of practice, challenges, and opportunities. And I'll introduce you in a minute to two great speakers who are very knowledgeable about this topic and will tell us all about it. If you could advance the slide, Molly. So I'm obviously not Lauren Hine, although I've always wanted to be. Lauren is backpacking somewhere very remote, and if we're lucky and she gets a signal, she may join us today. I'm Meg Whitaker, and I also help the A4 determine what the programming should be. So I'll facilitate the webinar today. And I want to talk about 3 priority questions. And as we move through the slides and listen to the 2 speakers, I want you to think about these 3 topics. First of all, how do we ensure that the voices of vulnerable and disproportionately impacted populations are adequately heard and addressed in our alternatives assessment methods and practice? I thought hard about this preparing for this webinar. Secondly, how do we also ensure that these populations don't bear the impact of trade-offs that are inevitably made during the AA process? And then finally, where is there opportunity for improvement in our AA practice? How can we do better? Next slide, please. So we've got 2 great speakers today. We're going to hear from José Bravo, who's the Executive Director of the Just Transition Alliance, and then Veena Singla, who's from the NRDC. And I'll give you their bios in a second before each of the presenters speaks. But I wanted to go over very quickly just a few webinar logistics. The logistics will be taken care of by the esteemed Molly Jacobs, who's great. Due to the number of participants on the webinar, all the lines are muted because this is one of the biggest webinars we've ever held. If you wish to ask a question, please raise your hand or type a question in the Q&A box located in the drop-down control panel at the top of your screen. We do want to encourage discussion on this webinar, so it's not quite so sterile, and we'll attempt to unmute lines of those who have their hands raised. If you have a very weak Wi-Fi connection, that may not be the best thing. We don't want to wait 10 minutes to try and listen to your question. So if you have a slow Wi-Fi connection, please use the chat function. Questions will be answered at the end of the panel discussion. We've made sure we have plenty of time for questions. We are recording this webinar and we will post this with the slide deck on the A4 website, just like all of our other webinars, and we encourage you to access those. And then finally, at the end of the webinar, we'll launch a short evaluation survey to help us with future webinars because we want to cater to your needs and also keep it very interesting as well. So with that, next slide, please. I'd like to introduce you to José. José Bravo is the Executive Director of the Just Transition Alliance. He's an internationally recognized leader on just transition, climate justice, and chemical issues as they relate to environmental justice, EJ communities, and then labor. He was born in Mexico and brought to the US as a child. And his work in social justice issues is rooted in his upbringing in the Southern California avocado fields alongside both his parents. He's worked on numerous campaigns in the US and Mexico in his 30 years of organizing. And he was also interviewed for Veena's report that she'll be discussing during her presentation later on in this webinar. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to José Bravo, and I'm sure we'll all learn a lot from his presentation. So go for it, José. And we're working on the microphone. Oh, I think we have success. Are you there, José?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Oh, great. That's how you know when people really want to listen to you if they're still here. So great. Go for it. We're very excited to listen to you. So great. Go ahead.
Good, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Good morning, everyone here in California. It's 9 a.m., 9:07, and this is a very interesting topic for us. I really want to thank everybody for inviting us on this webinar. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So environmental justice, what is it? So in 1990, we came together in Washington, D.C. at the first People of Color Summit, where we defined environmental justice principles. And in a nutshell, environmental justice is where we live, where we play, where we work, where we go to school, and where we worship. So it really encompasses not only our natural environment, but also our built environment and our workplaces. So for many years, we've been disproportionately impacted by legacy contamination, be it by generation of chemicals or generation of energy. We've dealt with the legacy of chemicals. So we wanted to make sure people understand that if our communities are delivered from harm, all communities would benefit as a whole. So today we wanted to talk about the fact that in our communities, there's some qualifiers that basically have our communities in the situations that we have. Part of it is lack of healthcare, healthy food. In communities of color, there are no supermarkets. We have to deal with the dollar stores and community or mom and pop stores. And in many instances, those food items are not very healthy. And again, we're talking about fence line communities right next to heavy industry, where, by the way, in the United States, we're finding more and more the fact that in our communities of color and low income communities, there is no zoning. Or if there is, it allows heavy industrial use right next to sensitive use. Next slide, please. So I'll talk about the quadruple effect, or our quadruple whammy effect. So in many instances, the raw materials to make chemicals come out of our neighborhoods or our communities or indigenous lands, and the petrochemicals are actually their life starts in indigenous communities as oil or tar sands or many other things. We then ship those into primarily communities of color. If anybody has a doubt, I would ask you to visit Cancer Alley, Louisiana. It's an 80-mile corridor from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, or Houston, which we literally feel is the bedrock of industrial pollution, where communities and people's houses are literally just yards away from millions and millions of pounds of toxic chemicals or petroleum products. We are often affected by air pollution, workplace hazards, poor air quality, poor water quality, and many other things. So farm workers are also exposed to pesticides and herbicides. And then we'll move on to the next slide, please. So here's just an example of a life cycle. We did this graphic as a life cycle of plastics with an environmental justice lens. So if you see here, the extraction of oil happens in our communities. The chemicals are made and placed in plastics in our community. Workers are affected by the products that they're making, the chemicals and such, and then they're transported. So there's heavy transport in our communities with truck travel, hundreds and thousands of trucks going in and out of the industrial sector. And then they're put into dollar stores in many instances. We also run a national campaign around dollar stores, and we've been dealing with dollar store products with toxics, everything from lead to phthalates to BPA, and many other chemicals of concern. And then again, consumers go into those dollar stores and are exposed. And then the plastic waste, once everybody has an idea that they're going to throw away that bag, it goes to our communities in the landfill, and ultimately it could also go into an incinerator or into a recycling facility that's also located in our communities. And then when we talk about plastics in the ocean, we all know that there's 5 gyres on the planet that are just tremendously large. And the fact is that those gyres have accumulated plastic waste for many, many years. And some of those are bigger than some of the states here in the United States that are out there in the ocean. But we have to take a deeper dive. Our dive is actually, there's people that do subsistence fishing, and that's their only source of protein in many instances and or livelihood. So we're seeing the decomposition of plastics, and then the pellets then migrating into fish and other ecosystems as well. So we have to take a deeper look at what we produce and what is the impact through all the process of its life cycle. Next slide. So part of the discussion here today is that we believe that environmental justice communities have been underrepresented in these.
We'll launch a short evaluation survey.
Though we're disproportionately impacted, and we believe that we should move towards inviting environmental justice leaders to that decision-making table. And not only to the decision making, but also to how it comes out in a new economy, how folks are brought in to a process where it benefits communities. In the Just Transition Alliance, we're moving towards pushing for regional economies and local economies, not global economies. We believe that a lot of what's happening now and what's been impacting our communities, it's because we're globalized, and what we make here can impact a community somewhere in Asia, and it's out of sight, out of mind. And we believe that we should move towards local or regional economies. And I just have to put this in here as well. You know, we from the Just Transition Alliance went to the oil school in Denver. Our partners with the workers inside refineries invited us to the oil school, and we learned everything there was to learn about how oil is extracted, how oil moves, how oil is produced into different chemicals and other and fuels. And you know, one of the things that they also taught us were these systems of safety, right? And the overarching system of safety that we should be focusing on is to engineer the danger out of chemicals. If we engineer the danger out of chemicals, I think that disproportionately we would also be safeguarded. But there are chemicals out there in society that don't belong, that are just too dangerous, and ultimately they need to be phased out. So next slide, please. So I kind of spoke ahead of myself. So the regional economies, reducing transportation, creating renewable energy sources out of non-toxic sustainable materials. You know, if I buy a solar panel for my house and I put it on the roof, it takes approximately 2.5 years for it to become carbon neutral. Why? Because it's brought from a different part of this planet on the other side of the world, and it's put on my roof, and it's literally not doing much of a benefit until about 2.5 years. So again, the reason too that we say about sustainable and non-toxic materials is everybody remembers how we all wanted dual pane vinyl windows put on our house so that the R factor inside our houses would be higher. And what that created, because of the use of PVC, was that there are companies in Louisiana that that literally expanded to a point where even they now pose even a greater risk to those people living right next door to them. So again, I think that we should look at hemp, we should look at other building materials and build these things sustainably. And when we talk about working with workers, we believe that if workers are also not at the table, then it can't be a just transition for us. I want to go through the legacy chemicals. For us, the legacy chemicals are lead, chrome 6, PFAS, PCBs, benzene, flame retardants, BPA, and organophosphates. That didn't make it, but again, organophosphates are the ones that contaminate our planet and also put people's health at risk in the fields that feed the people in the United States. Next slide. So thank you very, very much. That's my presentation, and thank you all.
Great. Thank you for a wonderful introduction and overview of environmental justice and how it impacts so many communities at all levels, not only the environment. That was great. And I see you've got your contact information on there as well. So we're going to transition and get a little bit more into the weeds. We're going to hear from Veena Singla from the NRDC. So Veena is a senior scientist at the NRDC, where she works on science and policy related chemicals and consumer products and building materials. Many of us know Veena from all the work that she's performed identifying safer substitutes. One of her specialties is in the communication of complex scientific information at the intersection of research and policy, and she's led and really pioneered groundbreaking policies which attempt to establish frameworks for safer chemical evaluation and substitution. The NRDC, in partnership with Californians for a Healthy and Green Economy, the Lowell Center for Sustainable Production, and Environmental and Public Health Consulting, issued really a groundbreaking report examining AA methods and practice, specifically in relation to environmental justice concerns. So we asked, the A4 asked Veena to share this report and provide her current reflections on the topic today, since it's so timely and so relevant. So Veena, why don't you take it from here and tell us all about it.
Thank you so much, Meg, and thank you to Molly and Lauren as well for bringing this topic to the alternatives assessment community. As you said, I think it's very timely, and I'm really glad we're having this discussion today. And thank you, Jose, for that great overview. And I'll be touching on a number of the themes Jose talked about in my presentation as well. The next slide, please. NRDC is an international environmental nonprofit that employs scientists, lawyers, and policy experts to advocate for science-based policies that protect human health and the environment. Next slide, please. And as Meg mentioned, this presentation is based on a report from 2017 that NRDC co-authored with Change, and copies of the report, the executive summary, and one-page fact sheet are available on NRDC's site. Next slide, please. So this was a collaborative project that was led by myself, Catherine Alcantar of Change, Ann Blake of Environmental and Public Health Consulting, and Sally Edwards at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. Next slide, please. So we started with an observation that toxic chemicals, we know, disproportionately harm vulnerable populations, and that regrettable substitutions for toxic chemicals have also harmed vulnerable populations. So as an example, looking at microwave popcorn, the butter flavoring in popcorn, diacetyl, caused serious and irreversible lung disease in manufacturing workers, and it was replaced by a chemical 2,3-pentanedione, which also caused serious irreversible lung disease in manufacturing workers. So workers were harmed by both the chemical of concern and its replacement chemical. Looking at the microwave bag and chemicals used to provide grease resistance, PFAS chemicals known as C8 or PFOA and PFOS, they're persistent chemicals linked with cancers and other health problems. And communities in proximity to sites that make and use these chemicals are most at risk. The Food and Drug Administration phased C8 PFAS chemicals out of food packaging uses in 2011, but these were replaced by other PFAS chemicals that we're now understanding are also persistent and toxic. So communities continue to be harmed. I wanted to highlight some work that the Campaign for Healthier Solutions has done on this issue, which, as Jose mentioned, the Just Transition Alliance is a part of this campaign. So in 2018, the Center for Environmental Health and the Campaign for Healthier Solutions found PFAS in 100% of the microwave popcorn bags tested from 4 different dollar stores. And the customers of these dollar stores are primarily low income and people of color. So that led us to the question, how could we be using alternatives assessment to make better decisions when it comes to populations who are most impacted by toxic chemicals? Next slide, please. We looked to the National Academies of Sciences 2014 report on alternatives assessment. And the NAS identified 2 major categories of inputs into alternatives assessment that both significantly influence decision making. So first, there's those data-driven elements, such as toxicology data on hazard endpoints. Second, there's the values-driven elements. So the value-driven elements may relate to the alternatives assessment process, such as decisions on the degree of disclosure and transparency. Will the alternatives assessment be made public? Which internal or external audiences will know what alternatives were considered? Another value element related to process is if and how stakeholders and which ones will be engaged in the alternatives assessment. Value-driven elements also relate to how decisions about what is considered safer are made. So for example, how are data gaps considered? If an alternative for a known carcinogen looks safer in some respects, but is missing data on developmental toxicity, could that still be considered a safer alternative? Values also play a major role in how decisions about trade-offs are made. So if an alternative to a banned flame retardant has less exposure to consumers, but poses greater hazards to workers, is that a safer alternative? Well, the NAS found that in answering these types of questions, the values applied play a large role in the final determination. The next slide, please. So the NAS noted that what is deemed safer ultimately reflects a set of personal, corporate, legislative, or other values. So the ultimate decision does reflect a specific values framework. But the NAS also found that despite the critical role that values are playing in decision-making, alternatives assessment protocols generally don't explicitly describe the values frameworks that are used to guide decisions. So this highlighted for us a major gap in how alternatives are being chosen. And the next slide, please. So the overall goal of our project was to describe an initial values framework based on environmental justice and public health principles that could guide decisions in alternatives assessment. And the overarching goal that we centered was health equity. What does that mean? Well, health equity has been defined as the value underlying a commitment to reduce and ultimately eliminate health disparities. Health equity means social justice with respect to health and reflects ethical and human rights concerns. Health equity means striving to equalize opportunities to be healthy. So another way I think about it is health equity means that everyone has the opportunity to obtain their highest level of health. And in thinking about health equity, vulnerable populations are very important because those are the populations that suffer the most health disparities. So for the purposes of our work, we define vulnerable populations as those that have been disproportionately impacted by toxic chemicals, have an increased likelihood of adverse health effects from toxic chemicals due to greater susceptibility or exposure, and have been and continue to be marginalized and excluded from processes and decisions that affect them. So these populations include a number of the populations José mentioned. So those that are exposed to toxic chemicals in their workplaces, low-income communities, communities of color, fence-line communities, communities that rely on subsistence for at least a portion of their diet, such as indigenous people of the Arctic, and infants, children, and pregnant women. So I want to note that while we defined vulnerable populations quite broadly to encompass chemical stressors, biological susceptibility, and social vulnerability, that the central role of race in health disparities is really key. And I think that the pandemic has laid this fact very bare. So racial equity is a really critical component that's necessary to achieve health equity. So that's the overall framework of principles and values from which we approach this question. So we conducted interviews with 5 key informants, analyzed the results of those interviews with further input from the key informants, and then summarized and made recommendations for alternatives assessment in that discussion draft report. Next slide, please. So our key informants are working at the intersection of environmental justice, public health, and chemical policy. We spoke with Ogunaya Dotson-Newman, who's with the JPB Foundation, José, who you met, Ernie Pacheco, who's with the Communication Workers of America, Catherine Porter with the Healthy Nails Salon Collaborative, and Vai Waghi with Alaska Community Action on Toxics. We selected our interviewees to reflect a variety of perspectives on vulnerable populations, including workers, communities of color, and indigenous communities. So what did we learn from our interviews? Next slide, please. We saw 3 key themes emerge. The first was related to information quality, access, and transparency. So who gets access to information about alternatives assessments, and is the same information given to all stakeholders? The second major theme was accounting for trade-offs. So what information is used to characterize trade-offs, and does it include consideration of the chemical's life cycle and cumulative impacts? And who has the power to ultimately decide if a trade-off is acceptable or not? And then finally, genuine stakeholder engagement. So this really speaks to the point José made about how EJ communities have generally not been engaged. So are stakeholders an important part of the decision-making process, and specifically stakeholders from populations who are most impacted by toxic chemicals? So I'll talk a little bit more about life cycle cumulative impacts and stakeholder engagement. Next slide, please. So there's this simplified diagram of the life cycle here, and you heard from José about the life cycle issues presented with that, the beginning of life, the extraction, processing, manufacture, and distribution phases, as well as the end of life, recycling and disposal. I also wanted to note that a great paper was shared yesterday in the A4 email about life cycle based alternatives assessment. Definitely recommend taking a look at that. So life cycle is important for a couple of reasons.
Environmental justice, EJ.
José noted, environmental justice communities are often located near sites related to that beginning and end of the life cycle where heavy industries occur. Life cycle is also important to think about in terms of the problem with burden shifting alternatives, as we call them in the discussion draft. So those are alternatives that might be safer for the consumer, but harmful to workers, or safer for human health, but harmful to the environment. So we need to think carefully about life cycle to ensure that the impacts to EJ communities are considered throughout the life cycle, as well as to identify those kind of burden shifting problems. I also wanted to speak a little bit more about cumulative impacts and give an example of a tool that can be used to evaluate cumulative impacts. So again, cumulative impacts, that means the combined effects of multiple environmental hazards and social stressors on health. So this map of California you see is generated by a tool called CalEnviroScreen. And this tool looks at the cumulative burden of environmental pollutants and social vulnerability and combines them into a total index. So it includes data on air pollution, drinking water contaminants, pesticides, toxic releases, traffic and other pollution sources, and metrics of social vulnerability, such as poverty, educational attainment, and housing affordability. And what you see on the map is that final total index combining all of those factors, and red is the worst, so the most cumulative burden, while green is the best. So this cumulative impact context really matters when you're thinking about the impacts of potential alternatives. So imagine communities in those red areas that are burdened by dirty air, dirty water, toxic industries, and poverty. So if an alternative looks safer in some respects, but adds more toxic exposures to this burden, who is it really safer for? And this leads into the other major theme I'll discuss today. On the next slide, please, which is genuine stakeholder engagement. And I'll for 1 second go back to cumulative impacts and note that CalEnviroScreen is a tool for California. EPA also has a tool called EJ Screen, which similarly looks at cumulative impacts, but it's for the entire US. So genuine stakeholder engagement. So here, I wanted to revisit the fact that those most impacted by toxic chemicals and its potential alternative are generally not part of the alternatives assessment process. The recommendation in the discussion draft is to identify those most impacted over the chemical life cycle and engage them in the alternatives assessment process. So ideally, stakeholders could be involved from the beginning of the process through choosing an alternative and implementation, and even post-implementation to evaluate
The US as a child, and his
further modifications are needed. And workers, for example, would have significant insight into the question of how well an alternative is working. Stakeholders can provide input into decisions on trade-offs that affect them, and they can also be a wealth of information on chemical uses, exposures, and potential social and economic impacts of alternatives. So as affected communities have generally not been engaged in alternatives assessment, there's a need to develop models of engagement that ensure meaningful involvement in the decisions that affect them. And I wanted to note IC2's stakeholder involvement module could serve as a good starting place for thinking about this. So what does it look like then if impacted communities are engaged in coming up with solutions? On the next slide, please. I'll go back to the example of the microwave popcorn. So the safer alternative requested by the Campaign for Healthier Solutions was for dollar stores to sell plain popcorn kernels in conjunction with paper bags. So the customer can then buy the kernels, mix them with oil and salt at home, place them in the paper bag, and microwave to make the popcorn. This alternative results in the complete removal of hazards that we were concerned about, because it removes the need for the functions provided by both those chemicals of concern, the butter flavor and the grease-resistant bag. And I think this shows when you engage those most impacted and center the value of health equity, what you get are different kinds of solutions. And in this case, I think it's remarkable for not being an incremental improvement or reduced hazard, but elimination of both the hazards we were concerned about. And as a bonus, there's this adorable video with kids in Oakland showing how to make microwave popcorn in a paper bag. I highly recommend it to bring some joy to your day. So on the next slide, the discussion draft paper covered a number of other important topics for alternatives assessment practice that I hope people will take some time to take a look at. An important section of our interviews asked the key informants to evaluate the commons principles for alternatives assessment with an equity lens, and whether these principles ensure the protection of vulnerable populations. So these commons principles were developed in 2013 by a collaborative effort, and our interviewees observed that while the principles are excellent, they don't explicitly encompass equity or the protection of vulnerable populations. So what we did was, using the input provided by our interviewees, we identified additional language that could serve as guidance to incorporate equity and address those values that are inherent in decision-making about safer alternatives. And now this middle blue and green diagram that you can't read, it shows the steps in the National Academy's Alternatives Assessment Framework. And what I wanted to point out is the light blue boxes that you kind of see throughout the diagram. And those light blue boxes are where we offer initial guidance for steps that can be taken throughout the alternatives assessment process to incorporate health equity and address those decision-making values. So the work we've done so far, we see as really just the first step in opening the discussion of ensuring alternatives assessments can protect vulnerable populations. And we need additional work to develop these recommendations and implement them into alternatives assessment practice. So I want to end by inviting you to join me in visioning a different future. One with an alternatives assessment process that engages and empowers vulnerable populations, avoids regrettable substitutions, and ultimately improves the health and lives of those who are most impacted by toxic chemicals. And he's worked about that and think about how you could be a part of that future. So thank you very much, and happy to take questions.
That's a fantastic presentation, and your points are spot on with a lot of what we need to do as a community. I just want to make a quick time check. We have 19 minutes, and I see Molly has posted in the chat a number of resources for listeners to check out that relates to the presentation. Thank you so much for this presentation. So Molly is going to launch a poll, and because we want to hear back from you. So Molly, why don't you take over on the poll?
Sure. Yeah, so we really wanted to use this poll to launch the discussion, and Veena raised, a number of different opportunities for alternatives assessment to better consider environmental justice concerns. And so we're interested to hear from you. What are the best ways for this community of practice to improve how environmental justice concerns are addressed in an alternatives assessment? So let us know what you think, and let's use this as a place to hear more from you about what you see as the opportunities going forward. And it looks like most of you have voted, so I'm going to close the poll. And all of the above. The vast majority of you feel that there's opportunities to update the commons principles for alternatives assessment, to look at our existing alternatives assessment framework with the lens of environmental justice and see what's necessary to update them from that vantage point. And also, perhaps when we do alternatives assessment trainings, that there might be a module that focuses on environmental justice concerns and how to better address them in alternatives assessment. So interesting, Meg. Maybe we take that and turn it into the next part of this, which is our questions and comments. And it looks like we do have a number of questions, and some of you have raised your hands as well. So we can try to unmute hand raised. Those who have their hand raised and actually hear from you directly, and otherwise Meg will read some of the questions and that have come in as well.
Sure, let's see. Let me unclick the, so you want to unmute the, if you can introduce yourself and say who you're with, and then identify your question.
So Trevor, I just unmuted your line if you want to raise your question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm from King County Hazardous Waste Management Program, and we are generally focused on like consumer products and small quantity generators, but a lot of prior environmental justice work has been focused on kind of large emitters, legacy pollutants, et cetera. I just wonder how the presenters think about sort of the different levels at which these exposures are occurring and how to sort of merge traditional thinking on environmental justice with the important need to get at smaller level exposures such as those occurring in indoor environments, et cetera.
So either Jose or Veena, you can either of you can take that one.
Well, I mean, ultimately, I think it all should be addressed, but for us, one of the legacy chemicals is lead. So inside the house, there's exposure. Outside the house, there's exposure from many different sources. So I don't really understand the frame of the question and how to get to it. I mean, we need to deal with both the internal, inside and outside of the house, and for many instances, that's my simplified answer. But I don't know exactly, because it could be two separate things people are being exposed to. And we're dealing with products from dollar stores at a national level that literally put people at risk by the chemicals that are in those products. And that is an unwarranted toxic trespass. So that means that people are not conscious about the toxics in those products.
I have some thoughts on this one too. This is Veena. Thank you, Trevor, for that question. I think there's so first of all, I agree that from a policy perspective, addressing these different sources has really been quite siloed, and quite siloed, and resulting in some gaps as well. So it's a challenge for sure, but I also think that there is a role for everyone to play, and I think that the work that Campaign for Healthier Solutions is done focusing on dollar stores as a good example, because dollar stores are the retailer, right? They're not the producer of the products, but they have a lot of decision-making power in terms of their own policies on what products they allow, that can affect their suppliers. So, you know, I would say that what's needed is a multi-sector approach, to address the different levels and sources. But I think in terms of a policy framework, it's not really there yet.
So this is a perfect segue from a question from Joel, and we've had many questions, by the way, so I don't know if we'll get through all of them during the webinar. But Joel Tickner pointed out the speakers make a clear case as to the need to consider environmental justice impacts in alternatives assessment. Depending on where in the value chain the decision is being made, the assessor may not have access to information on where or how the alternatives are produced, and may not have the resources to do a large stakeholder engagement to figure that out. How can an approach be applied while not overtaxing resources? So it's a problem we often see in regards to heavy quantitative assessment frameworks in AA. And there's probably not an easy answer, but you know, either Jose or Veena, if you have some insight on that. So how do we not overtax resources, and how do we incorporate this into our decision making?
I'll start on that one, and Jose, feel free to add your thoughts too. So I think resources are always a challenge. So I appreciate this question. I have two answers to this. First, I would say there's some initial guidance that we provided in the discussion draft around some decision rules that can be applied in the alternatives assessment process that do not take additional resources generally. So it's, for example, looking at hazard data and removing certain kinds of chemicals from consideration as alternatives. So these are the kinds of chemicals that have historically most impacted environmental justice communities. So persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic chemicals, and chemicals with chronic health impacts, carcinogens, reproductive, and developmental toxicants. So I'd say like those kinds of decision rules where chemicals with those types of hazards are removed from consideration as alternatives could be a initial way for practitioners to start to incorporate some of this kind of thinking. It's the first answer. The second answer would be, I think this is an area that could use further development from the community of practice. That depending on who's doing the assessment, right? I mean, I think this was one of the main points of the National Academy's report, right? That who's doing the assessment is going to really influence the values that are applied and the decisions that are made. So how can there be integration between, for example, corporate values and the values that are needed to center health equity? I don't know the answer to that, but I think that's an area where the community of practice could really do more work.
Mm-hmm. And Sally noted and this will relate, Jose could answer Sally's question, which leads right into this. I think stakeholder engagement from disproportionately impacted populations is part of the key. And Sally said, as co-author, I'm delighted to see the renewed interest in the findings of the report. But what do you see? And I think, Jose, since based on all of your work, what are the next steps for increasing stakeholder engagement from disproportionately impacted populations so that those of us who are doing AAs actually know that there are people who are disproportionately impacted? How do we increase their engagement?
And Sally,
So
I did just unmute your line if you want to expand on your comment at all or question.
Yeah, I did. Well, I just want to say this is Sally Edwards. I'm delighted that to hear Jose and Veena sharing some of the findings from this report and giving a bigger picture of the environmental justice issues. And, you know, I remember when we really saw this report as a starting point for discussion, particularly around the central issue of ensuring that disproportionately impacted communities have a voice in the alternatives assessment process throughout the process in terms of how we set priorities for alternatives assessments, and particularly when decisions are being made about trade-offs, ensuring that, because sometimes we have to make a decision that's not necessarily considered to be the decision forever, but it's an interim decision. But then because of other pressures, there's not an incentive to come back and make sure that a better decision gets made down the line. And that we found in our discussions with our informants that vulnerable populations are often the ones that are bearing the brunt of those decisions. So I really see as central here figuring out a way to bring in the voices of a different set of stakeholders. And as you know, as Joel mentioned, this can be really challenging to do with limited resources, but we really need to dig in and figure this out together. So I'm curious to hear from Veena and from Jose, you know, your initial thoughts about that. And, you know, we had initially thought when we did this report, we would do a broader convening to start to really get some good answers to this question.
Those are great points, Sally. Jose, do you have any feedback? We've got about 5 minutes left and one poll still to go through.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that, you know, looking at that poll that we did a little while ago, I think that it's important to keep in consideration some of that guidance as well. But trainings, community folks are starting from a disadvantage because of the lack of understanding or knowledge of this issue. And then conscious involvement of environmental justice communities in stakeholders, equal stakeholders, right? And in many instances, even sharing reports and such with environmental justice communities and folks. So the other is resource sharing. I understand that there's very little resources, but we have built a movement on probably the least resources out there. So again, I think that leveling out the playing field needs to be happening so that there can be people be more involved.
That's great. We've got, because we've got a few minutes left, I'd like to lead into the second poll that Molly will take care of because we want your feedback.
Great.
Go ahead, Molly.
Yeah. So this second poll, you know, I think it's moving us towards what's next. Many of you expressed, you know, that there are opportunities. Jose mentioned another one, meaning a stronger focus on resource sharing. But how interested are you to work on these opportunities to help alternatives assessments better address environmental justice? So let us know, is this an area of work that the community of practice has and interested to pursue together? And if so, we can work together to figure out what would be next, just as Sally described, seeing that this discussion report was really seen as kind of the first step in perhaps a longer journey on this topic. And it looks like you are all very interested. So that's 70% of you said very interested, and 22% are somewhat, and the rest of you neutral. So I think this speaks to a potential area, of collective work for all of us going forward. And we'll need just to discuss, what that might look like in the future. And with that, maybe I'll just turn it back to Meg to close us out.
Great. So we've put together some resources for you that specifically relate to environmental justice. And remember, this will be posted on the A4 website. But these contain some of the best resources that pertain to today's presentation. So please make use of those. And I've got another announcement on the next slide. Please make sure to mark your calendar. We will be meeting virtually. Our symposium, Current Practices and Future Prospects, will be held October 27th to the 29th. You can take a quick look at our program, but we want you involved and we want you to participate because we're growing as a society. And then finally, next slide. We're only as strong as our members. So we need you to join A4 and be part of the answer, be part of the solution for safer chemicals for all, not just for some people or for part of the environment. So we want you to join A4, be part of us, participate. We'd love to have you. This has been a great webinar. I think it's been the highest attended webinar to date, and it's clear that there's an interest and there's a lot of work to do. So I'd like to thank both of our presenters today. I know both of you are very busy, and it was very informative. We hope to continue the conversation, and I know I'm going to think about how I can incorporate this into my practice. So thank you, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you at a future webinar. Have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.